150 feet. That's how deep the newest bunker buster in the American arsenal can punch through solid rock before it even detonates. And this week, the aircraft capable of carrying it went back to the fight. Not the B-2, a completely different bomber, one most people don't even associate with bunker-busting capability at all. Let's actually verify this story properly, piece by piece, because there's real news buried in here, and there's also some genuine confusion floating around about which bomb, which bomber, and which specific mission this all refers to. I pulled this from the War Zone, Axios, Forbes, and the National Security Journal, so let's separate what's confirmed from what's still developing, one verified detail at a time. I want to set the ground rules for this video up front, because a story like this one lives or dies on precision. 3 different bombs are going to come up, 2 different bombers, and at least one weapon that doesn't exist yet outside of a design contract. Keeping those separate, rather than letting them blur into one generic bunker buster story, is the entire point of this breakdown. So bear with the specifics, because they're exactly what makes the difference between a real headline and an oversold one. First, the weapon itself, because newest bunker buster is a specific, checkable claim, and it points to a real bomb that most coverage of this war barely mentions. It's called the GBU-72, sometimes referred to by its component name, the Advanced 5K. It's a 5,000-pound class weapon, built around something called the BLU-138 penetrating warhead, paired with a GPS and inertial navigation guidance tail kit. It was specifically developed to replace an older weapon, the GBU-28, which had been in service since 1991. That makes the newest claim genuinely accurate. This is a newer generation of bunker buster than the weapon it's succeeding, engineered with better penetration and a delayed fuse that lets it punch through layers of rock, concrete, or soil before detonating at depth, maximizing the destructive effect underground rather than on the surface. It's worth understanding the engineering story behind why a weapon like this even needs to exist, separate from the raw numbers. Older bunker busters like the GBU-28 relied heavily on brute mass, essentially betting that enough weight and velocity alone would punch through whatever was in the way. The GBU-72's design philosophy is different, combining a purpose-built penetrator warhead with modern guidance and a precisely tuned delayed fuse, so the weapon doesn't just rely on raw force, it's engineered to actually sense or time its way to detonating at exactly the right depth inside a target, rather than simply as deep as momentum happens to carry it. That's the difference between a blunt instrument and a genuinely modern precision weapon, even though both categories get lumped under the same bunker buster label in most headlines. Here's the number that actually matters for understanding why this bomb exists at all. Reports describe the GBU-72 as capable of penetrating up to 150 feet into the ground. That's not a typo, and it's not far behind the far larger, far more famous 30,000-pound MOP that made headlines during the original strikes on Iran's nuclear sites last year. The GBU-72 achieves nearly comparable penetration at a fraction of the weight, which is exactly the trade-off that makes it useful. It can go places, on more aircraft, that the massive MOP simply can't. And that's the actual key fact behind this entire story. The 30,000-pound GBU-57 MOP can only be carried by the B-2 Spirit. Every outlet covering this war repeats that detail because it's true and it matters. But the GBU-72 was designed differently, specifically to be deployable from a much wider range of aircraft. It's been tested on the F-15E Strike Eagle. The Air Force has floated, integrating it onto the B-2 as well. And critically, pictures have emerged going back to 2024 of a B-1 bomber carrying one of these bombs. That's the entire premise behind this video's title, A Real Bomb, A Real Bomber, and a documented pairing between the two that existed before this current war even reached its current phase. So did a B-1 actually drop this specific weapon on Iran? Here's where the story requires real care, because 2 separate things have been happening simultaneously, and conflating them is exactly how a headline ends up overselling what's actually confirmed. Back in March, reporting described the US using its new 5,000-pound bunker busters, the GBU-72, to destroy Iranian anti-ship missile sites, likely located in the Zagros mountain range along the Persian Gulf coastline. That's a real reported strike, using this exact weapon. What's less clear from that same reporting is which aircraft actually delivered it. CENTCOM, when asked directly by the War Zone about the specific munitions used in a related round of strikes along the Strait of Hormuz, declined to comment on the record. It's worth being precise about what unclear which aircraft actually means here too, because it's not that the delivery platform is a total mystery, it's that multiple aircraft were plausible candidates at the time. The GBU-72 had already been tested successfully on an F-15E Strike Eagle back in 2021, well before this war began. That same aircraft type has been flying strike missions against Iran throughout this conflict. So even with a confirmed GBU-72 strike on record from March, the honest answer to which bomber dropped it includes at least 3 plausible candidates: the F-15E, the B-1, and potentially the B-2, rather than a single obvious answer. That's exactly the kind of ambiguity that a confident headline tends to resolve in whichever direction sounds most dramatic, rather than the direction the actual sourcing supports. Separately, and this is the part that's genuinely new this week, B-1 bombers have returned to active strike missions against Iran, tracked departing an English airfield and hitting Revolutionary Guard targets. Axios reported directly that the U.S. military used a B-1 long-range bomber on a Tuesday to strike IRGC targets in Iran, citing U.S. officials. CENTCOM, again, didn't confirm details about how the B-1 was actually used or to what munitions it carried that specific night. So you have two separately confirmed facts: a real bunker buster being used against Iranian targets in March, and a real B-1 mission against Iran just this week, and a real documented history of B-1s being loaded with exactly this kind of bomb. What you don't have, at least not yet, on the public record, is a single specific named strike where a B-1 is confirmed to have dropped a GBU-72 on a named Iranian target. That's the honest gap between what this title implies and what's actually been nailed down, and it's a gap worth naming clearly, rather than quietly papering over with confident-sounding language. There's a second bunker buster in this story too, and mixing it up with the GBU-72 is an easy mistake to make. So let's clear it up directly. Back in March, footage out of RAF Fairford in England showed B-1 bombers being loaded with GBU-31 JDAMs fitted with BLU-109 warheads, a 2,000-pound class bunker buster, a completely different, smaller, older weapon than the GBU-72. That's the munition most directly, visually confirmed on a B-1 in this war so far, not the newer 5,000-pound weapon. The Forbes and Warzone reporting from that same period was explicit that this pairing, B-1s carrying the smaller BLU-109 warhead, was itself a signal, described as a sign of increasing air supremacy over Iran, since switching from standoff cruise missiles to direct JDAM strikes only makes sense once an adversary's air defenses are degraded enough that a non-stealth bomber can operate more directly over target. That March buildup is worth walking through in a bit more detail, because the scale of it tells you something about how deliberate this bomber redeployment has been. The bomber force at RAF Fairford expanded rapidly over just a few days, from 9 American bombers, 3 B-52s and 6 B-1s, to 15 total 3 B-52s and 12 B-1Bs. That kind of rapid buildup at a single overseas base doesn't happen casually. It reflects a deliberate decision to concentrate a large, sustained strike capability in the region, well ahead of any single dramatic announcement. It's also worth knowing that this specific basing arrangement required a political shift. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer had initially denied the US access to UK bases for strikes on Iran, only relenting after Iran carried out a drone strike on a Royal Air Force base in Cyprus, which tells you even the basic geography of this bombing campaign has been shaped by escalating Iranian actions as much as by American planning. Visual confirmation matters a lot in a story like this one, and it's worth being clear about exactly what kind of evidence each claim rests on. The BLU-109 warhead loaded onto B-1s at Fairford was documented in actual video footage, released and reviewed by the Warzone, showing the weapons being physically loaded onto the aircraft's revolving weapons rack. The GBU-72's connection to the B-1 rests on a different, older kind of evidence, photographs from 2024 showing the pairing in what appears to be a training or testing context, not a documented combat loadout from the specific war. Both are real, both are meaningful, but they represent two different strengths of evidence. And conflating a 2024 test photo with a March 2026 combat loading is exactly the kind of imprecision that turns a well-sourced story into an overstated one. I want to walk through why the B-1's return to this fight matters even independent of exactly which bunker buster it's carrying on any given night, because the aircraft itself tells a story. The B-1 Lancer isn't stealthy. Unlike the B-2, it doesn't hide from radar at all, and multiple outlets covering its return specifically noted that fact as the headline detail, not a footnote. A National Security Journal piece on the story put it directly: the bomber America sent over Iran cannot hide from radar at all, and that's precisely what makes it significant. Sending a highly visible, easily tracked aircraft directly into contested airspace is a statement in itself. It only makes sense if you're confident the enemy's ability to actually shoot it down has already been seriously degraded. So the B-1's return isn't just about payload, it's a signal about how much control of the skies over Iran the US currently believes it has established, independent of any single bomb it happens to be carrying. There's a useful historical detail worth adding here too, because the B-1 wasn't always a purely conventional bomber. Following the end of the Cold War, the Lancer's nuclear capabilities were formally removed, shifting its entire role from a nuclear deterrent platform to a dedicated conventional bomber. That transition is part of why it's so well suited to exactly this kind of high-volume, direct strike mission today. The airframe was specifically repurposed and optimized over decades for delivering large, varied conventional payloads rather than sitting on standby as part of a nuclear triad. It's also worth knowing this particular airframe's days are numbered on a completely separate timeline from anything happening in this war. Current Air Force plans call for the B-1 fleet to be retired in the coming years, as the newer, stealthier B-21 Raider enter service, which makes this current deployment one of the aircraft's last major combat roles before it's phased out entirely, a detail that adds its own layer of significance to seeing it back in active use right now. The B-1 does bring real capability regardless of which specific bunker buster ends up loaded onto it. This is a genuinely massive aircraft in terms of raw payload, capable of carrying up to 84 precision-guided glide bombs, or as many as 36 long-range cruise missiles, more ordnance in a single airframe than many guided missile warships carry. It can remain over a combat zone for more than 6 hours while providing support, and it's equipped with targeting systems specifically designed to help distinguish military objectives from friendly or civilian presence on the ground. None of that changes the fact that it cannot carry the full 30,000-pound MOP. That capability remains exclusively the B-2s, but it means a B-1 carrying even the smaller GBU-72 or the BLU-109 warhead can still deliver serious, sustained bunker-busting capability across an entire mission, hitting multiple hardened targets in a single sortie rather than the single, massive strike a MOP-carrying B-2 mission represents. To put those payload figures in more concrete terms, the Air Force describes the B-1B as capable of carrying upwards of 75,000 pounds of ordnance internally, broken down into configurations like 84 500-pound Mark 82 bombs, or 24 of the larger 2,000-pound general-purpose bombs. That's genuinely the largest payload of any bomber type in the current U.S. fleet, larger than the stealthier B-2 and larger than the older B-52, even though it lacks the B-2's specific certification to carry the single heaviest individual weapon, the MOP. There's an entire fleet behind this capability too, not just the aircraft currently deployed to the region. The Air Force maintains 45 active-duty B-1B Lancers total, based primarily at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota and Dyess Air Force Base in Texas, which gives you a sense of the broader reserve capacity sitting behind whatever specific number of bombers is actively flying missions against Iran at any given moment. Now let's talk about the specific target that's actually driving this renewed B-1 activity, because it's the most important context for understanding why this bomber came back into the story right now. Trump himself named it directly from the White House this week. Pickax Mountain, also known by its Farsi name, Ku-e-Kolang Gazla, a nuclear site still under construction, buried deep underground near Natanz. Trump's exact words to reporters were, quote, "We'll be hitting that area pretty soon, and very heavily." Israeli intelligence reportedly believes Iran has already moved thousands of uranium enrichment centrifuges into tunnels deep inside that mountain, along with part of the country's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium transferred there specifically in anticipation of exactly this kind of American or Israeli strike threat. It's worth understanding why a site like Pickax Mountain even exists in the first place, because it tells you something about the broader pattern of this entire war. After Fordo and Natanz took catastrophic damage in last year's Operation Midnight Hammer, independent nuclear monitoring organizations have separately noted that Iran appears to have continued construction at this new site, specifically because it's reportedly built even deeper into the mountain than Fordo ever was, an apparent attempt to build something that could survive even a direct MOP strike. If that assessment is accurate, it would mean Pickax Mountain represents a kind of arms race in miniature, playing out entirely underground, Iran building deeper in direct response to the exact weapon America already proved it could use against Fordo, and America simultaneously developing lighter, more widely deployable penetrators like the GBU-72 in response. That's genuinely significant context, because it tells you the B-1's return to the region isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening alongside a direct, named presidential threat against a specific, deeply buried nuclear facility, one that would almost certainly require exactly the kind of penetrating capability the GBU-72, or potentially even the full MOP, was built for. Whether the B-1 itself ends up involved in a strike on Pickax Mountain specifically, or whether that mission ultimately falls to the B-2 given the sheer depth involved, isn't something that's been confirmed yet either. What's confirmed is the threat named directly on the record, and the B-1's return to active strike missions in the same general window. There's also a practical, logistical reason worth considering for why the B-1 specifically might be well suited to a target like Pickax Mountain, even if it ultimately can't carry the single largest bomb available. A site this deeply buried might not be defeatable with a single weapon at all, regardless of size. It might instead require multiple, sequential strikes on the same aim point, a technique defense analysts have specifically noted CENTCOM has used before against other hardened Iranian targets, stacking smaller penetrators on the same spot to achieve a combined effect deeper than any single weapon could manage alone. The B-1's sheer payload capacity, up to 24 2,000-pound bombs or dozens of cruise missiles in a single sortie, makes it a genuinely strong platform for exactly that kind of repeated, stacked strike approach, even without ever needing to carry the full 30,000-pound MOP itself. Let's talk about where this technology is actually heading next, because it adds an interesting layer to the newest claim in this title. The Air Force has already awarded a contract for an entirely new bunker buster called the Next Generation Penetrator, specifically designed to eventually replace the 30,000-pound GBU-57 MOP itself. Boeing, the same contractor behind the original MOP, will design that weapon's tail kit. The Air Force has specified it shouldn't exceed 22,000 pounds, lighter than the current MOP, while aiming to preserve serious blast and fragmentation capability against deeply buried targets. That program is still in early design stages. It hasn't been used in this war, or any war, but it tells you the GBU-72 currently in use isn't actually the endpoint of this technology. It's a middle step, a lighter, more widely deployable bunker buster, bridging the gap between the older GBU-28 and whatever eventually replaces the massive GBU-57 entirely. It's worth sitting with the timeline behind that Next Generation Penetrator program for a second, because it tells you something about how military procurement actually works versus how a headline like this one might make it sound. The Air Force didn't wait until after this war started to begin designing a successor to the MOP. That request for a prototype penetrator warhead design capable of, in the Air Force's own words, defeating hard and deeply buried targets, was already in motion earlier this year, before the current phase of strikes against sites like Fordo and Pickax Mountain fully played out. That timeline matters, because it means this specific war is functioning as something closer to a live-fire proving ground for a weapons development pipeline that was already underway, rather than the war itself having spontaneously triggered a rushed new weapons program from scratch. I think that broader arc is actually the most interesting part of this story, more interesting than any single strike report. The U.S. military has been running, simultaneously, a three-tier bunker buster strategy throughout this war. The massive 30,000-pound GBU-57, reserved for the deepest, hardest targets and exclusively carried by the B-2. The newer, lighter 5,000-pound GBU-72, deployable across a much wider range of aircraft, including, per the documented 2024 imagery, the B-1. And the older, smaller, 2,000-pound BLU-109 warhead, the one actually confirmed loaded onto B-1s at RAF Fairford back in March. Still useful against less deeply buried targets. 3 different tools, 3 different weights, 3 different levels of aircraft access, all deployed based on what a specific target actually requires, rather than always reaching for the biggest available option. That tiered approach is worth understanding as deliberate military doctrine, not improvisation, reserving the most expensive, most limited weapon, the MOP, for only the handful of targets that genuinely require it, while using more widely available, less scarce weapons like the GBU-72 and the BLU-109 warhead for everything else, is exactly the kind of resource allocation you'd expect from a military running a sustained, multi-month campaign rather than a single, one-off strike. It also means that every time a headline claims a specific bomb was used somewhere in this war, there are now genuinely 3 plausible candidates, rather than 1, which is exactly why verifying the specific weapon named in any given report matters as much as verifying the target or the casualty count. Let me give you my honest verdict on this specific headline. The underlying claim that the newest bunker buster in the American arsenal has a documented real connection to the B-1 bomber, and that both have been active in this war, is true. B-1s have been photographed carrying the GBU-72 as far back as 2024. B-1s are confirmed back in active strike missions against Iran as of this week. The GBU-72 has been reportedly used against Iranian targets earlier in this war. But the specific, singular claim that a B-1 has been confirmed dropping this exact weapon on a named Iranian target this week hasn't been nailed down on the public record yet, at least not as of the most current reporting available. CENTCOM has declined to specify munitions on more than one occasion when directly asked, which is standard operational security practice, not evidence of anything hidden, but it does mean the precise pairing this title implies remains plausible and well supported by circumstantial and historical evidence, without being a confirmed singular fact yet. I think that's actually a more useful place to land than either extreme. Dismissing the story entirely would ignore a real documented capability and a real current redeployment that both point in exactly this direction. Treating it as fully confirmed would go further than CENTCOM's own on-record statements currently support. The honest version sits in between a real weapon, a real bomber, a real strategic buildup toward a named target, Pickax Mountain, with the final, specific confirmation of exactly which bomb hits exactly which target still, as of right now, an open question. It's worth naming exactly why CENTCOM's silence on specific munitions shouldn't be read as suspicious on its own, because that's an easy misread. Militaries routinely decline to confirm exact weapons used in a given strike, for reasons that have nothing to do with hiding wrongdoing, revealing which specific penetrator defeated which specific hardened target can hand an adversary useful engineering information about exactly how deep their remaining facilities need to be built to survive the next one. That operational logic applies just as much to Iran's own construction decisions at a site like Pickax Mountain as it does to anything else in this war, which is part of why getting a clean, on-record weapon-by-weapon confirmation for every strike in this conflict has been consistently difficult throughout, not just in this specific case. There's also a broader lesson here about how these stories tend to spread once a real, verifiable weapon gets attached to a live, ongoing war. A genuine capability, documented in a 2024 test photo, gets combined with a genuine current redeployment, the B-1's return this week, and a genuine, on-record presidential threat against a specific target, Pickax Mountain, and the combination reads, understandably, like a single confirmed event. But each of those three pieces has its own separate timeline and its own separate level of confirmation, and treating them as one seamless, already completed story is exactly the kind of collapsing together that turns a genuinely interesting, well-documented set of facts into a headline that oversells what's actually been nailed down. I'll be watching closely for whatever CENTCOM does eventually confirm about the specific munitions used in any upcoming strikes tied to Pickax Mountain, because that's the moment the story moves from well-supported inference to fully verified fact. Given how deeply that specific site is reportedly buried, and given Trump's own direct, on-record threat to hit it very heavily, it's a genuinely plausible next chapter for exactly the weapon this video is about. The specific marker worth watching for is straightforward: a CENTCOM release or a Pentagon briefing that names both the aircraft and the munition together, the same level of detail General Kane provided after the original Fordo strikes last year, rather than the vaguer target category language CENTCOM is mostly stuck to throughout this current phase of the war. If breakdowns like this, ones that trace a specific bomb and a specific bomber through the actual documented history rather than just assuming the flashiest possible pairing, are why you keep coming back here, go ahead and subscribe with notifications on. Because if CENTCOM does confirm this exact combination on a future strike, I'll have the verified version out fast, with the same care about separating confirmed fact from plausible inference that this entire video has tried to model. And I want your take on this one. Does knowing the B-1 can't carry the full 30,000-pound MOP, but can carry this newer, lighter bunker buster instead, change how you think about what's actually coming for a target like Pickax Mountain? Do you think a stacked multi-strike approach with a lighter weapon is more likely for a target this deep? Or does a site this significant eventually pull the B-2 and the full MOP back into the picture, regardless of what the B-1 has been doing this week? Tell me what you think in the comments, and let me know if you want the next breakdown to dig into Pickax Mountain specifically, the broader bunker buster arsenal this war has put on display, or the Next Generation Penetrator program still sitting in early development. That's where I'll leave this one. See you in the next video.